Well, folks, I think we'll get started, and as latecomers come in, that's okay. They can catch up a little bit. We are very, very honored this evening to be able to host Rabbi Sally Priesand. I'm sure most of you know at least her name, and maybe not as close as Dick and Karen Solomon had connection with her, but she's basically a household name in the Reform movement and well beyond in America's Jewish community. I feel especially privileged to welcome Rabbi Priesand in this year. Not only is it the 50th anniversary of her ordination, but maybe some of you have read that this is also the 100th anniversary of when the Central Conference of American Rabbis voted at their convention that women should be admitted to the program, although it didn't happen for another 50 years after that. And also, 1922 was the year of the first bat mitzvah. So this year is a very significant year. For me, it's a significant year because it's the 40th anniversary of my ordination, and there was no question who my ordination class wanted to have as the guest speaker at our ordination ceremony on Shabbat morning, but Rabbi Sally Priesand, because it was the 10th anniversary of her ordination. I also had the privilege to travel with Rabbi Priesand to Europe in 2014, to Germany and the Czech Republic in the footsteps of Rabbi Regina Jonas, who you're going to hear a little bit about tonight. So that's my personal connection and feeling of excitement about having her as our guest this evening. But I'm just going to also read you very briefly from her bio. Rabbi Priesand served at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City for 7 years upon ordination. She was assistant rabbi and then associate rabbi there. And then after that, there were other things in between, but from 1981 to 2006, she served as rabbi of Monmouth Reform Temple in Tinton Falls, New Jersey, where apparently Karen and Dick from Beth Hillel encountered her and members of her congregation. She retired in 2006 and became Rabbi Emerita, and she's done a lot of writing, books and articles and speaking engagements since then. I'll just highlight one that she contributed to The Sacred Calling, 4 Decades of Women in the Rabbinate, which won the National Book Award. It came out a few years ago. So she likes short introductions, so that's going to be it. I'm going to ask everybody else to mute and turn the program over to Rabbi Priesand. Welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for that very warm and gracious introduction. I wish I could be with you in person, but I am grateful that the gift of modern technology enables us to connect in this way. I've kind of come to think of Zoom as the silver lining of COVID. Without it, I would never be able to visit so many congregations this year and meet new people. And as you have heard, I have known and admired Rabbi Feingold for many years now. I was the speaker at her ordination, and the fact that she has been your rabbi for pretty much her entire career reflects just how beloved she is. Both of us are also supporters of the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, directed by one of her classmates, Dr. Gary Zola. And we serve together on the B'nai Yaakov Council, which supports the archives, and we enjoy sharing memories of Dr. Jacob Rader Marcus, our teacher who founded the archives. Next week is our CCAR convention. So I am, conventions really are the one place that rabbis most often get to see each other and catch up. So I'm looking forward to seeing Rabbi Feingold in person. Tonight, I want to tell you a little bit about my journey to the rabbinate and share some reflections on my career as the 50th anniversary of my ordination approaches, and there will be time at the end for your questions. I decided I wanted to be a rabbi when I was 16 years old. Unfortunately, I don't remember why. I remember thinking that I always wanted to be a teacher, and whatever my favorite subject was is what I was going to teach. So one year I was going to be an English teacher, and then a French teacher, maybe a math teacher. And in the end, I decided to be a teacher of Judaism, which is what a rabbi really is. Fortunately for me, my parents gave me what I consider to be one of the greatest gifts that a parent can give a child, and that is the courage to dare and to dream. As a result, I remained focused on my goal, unconcerned that no woman had ever been ordained rabbi in America, and determined to succeed despite the doubts I heard expressed in the organized Jewish community. In those days, I did not think very much about being a pioneer, nor was it my intention to champion the rights of women. I just wanted to be a rabbi. Although my parents were actively involved in Jewish organizational life, my family was not particularly observant. We did light Shabbat candles, celebrate Hanukkah with our extended family, and have a Passover Seder, to which each of my siblings and I were encouraged to invite a non-Jewish friend to enjoy the festivities and learn more about Judaism. I can still see my father at the head of our table, reclining on his pillow, leaving the table at the appropriate time to wash his hands, explaining the symbols on the Seder plate, and reading every single word of the Haggadah. My mother, of course, had been preparing for days, making gefilte fish from scratch and fashioning those delicious matzah balls that were especially light and fluffy. One year, my father's business brought him into contact with a Catholic children's home run by a group of nuns. Passover was approaching, and in the course of conversation, the Mother Superior began asking questions about the customs and traditions of this holiday. Before long, my father had offered to conduct a Seder for 52 nuns and the Monsignor, volunteering my mother, of course, to oversee the meal and make enough chicken soup and matzo balls for all the participants. My father read the Haggadah, and the youngest nun recited the 4 questions. My mother, whom we lost just a few years ago at the age of 101, remembered entering the dining room that day and being greeted by a huge sign that said simply, Shalom. Moreover, the nuns presented her with a 2-tiered silver tray that we continued to cherish. My father died in 1968. I will never forget the kindness of the nuns who, dressed in their traditional garb, came to our home while we were sitting Shiva to remember my father and give thanks for his life. And I'm ever grateful to my parents for teaching us by example that all people are God's children, and we have much to learn from each other. As soon as I began to express more than a passing interest in our religious heritage, my parents made certain to include among my birthday or Hanukkah presents more Jewish books, often inscribed by my father with a few words of encouragement, a wonderful way to expand my horizons and at the same time validate the seriousness of my intention. I grew up in the suburbs of Cleveland, and when I was in the 8th grade, My family moved from the east side of town to the west side. As a result, my teenage years were spent in a predominantly non-Jewish neighborhood. In fact, my brothers and I were the only Jews in our high school. That made our participation in religious school and youth group all the more essential. We were active members of Beth Israel, the West Temple, a small congregation that taught me important lessons about what it means to be a temple family and how central to Jewish life is the task of tikkun olam, repairing the world. Although I did not become bat mitzvah, I was confirmed and continued my religious education through the 12th grade. As time for college approached, my desire to be a teacher of Judaism remained firm, and I knew that for me, the best way to accomplish that goal was a career in the rabbinate. I applied to the undergraduate program jointly sponsored by the University of Cincinnati and the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. I was accepted and in 1964 began my studies. My years in rabbinic school were fraught with challenge. Some members of the college community thought I came to marry a rabbi rather than be one. In fact, I had been dating one of my fellow students for some time when a professor went up to him and said, "Well, when are you going to marry her, do the school a favor, and get rid of her?" So there were challenges along the way. My sincerity was often suspect. I was under constant pressure to prove myself. Always I felt the need to be better and do better than my classmates so that my commitment and my academic ability would not be questioned. Occasionally, I sensed that some people would not be overly upset if I failed. More than once, it would have been easy to drop out, but I persevered because I truly wanted to be a teacher of Torah. Happily, I had the support of Dr. Nelson Glick, at that time president of the College Institute. He gave me his unqualified support and he took care of a lot of little problems in the background, problems that I probably never even heard about. Unfortunately, he died the year before I was ordained. But his wife, Helen, a distinguished physician and researcher in Cincinnati, told me that prior to his death, he said there were 3 things he wanted to live to do, and one of them was to ordain me. His vision and his commitment laid the foundation for the ordination of women. And fortunately for me and for all of us, his successor, Dr. Alfred Gottschalk, shared that vision. And when he became president of the College Institute, he made the dream a reality by ordaining me on June 3rd, 1972, together with the 35 men who were my classmates. Only in recent years have I come to understand how bold and daring that action was on his part. Apparently, certain members of the faculty tried to convince him that I should not be ordained. 50 years ago, I did not really realize the amount of pressure he was under, nor did I understand the courage it took for him to step into someone else's shoes and fulfill a mission someone else had begun. How grateful I am that he was willing to do that and to affirm the equality of women in the Reformed Jewish community. Now, finding a job was not all that easy. Some congregations wanted me for my publicity value. They wanted to be able to say they were the first to hire a female rabbi. Others would not talk to me at all. In the end, I was the last person in my class to get a job, but I always have felt that I got the best job of all, assistant rabbi at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City. It always seemed appropriate to me that I would come to a synagogue with a reputation for commitment to equality and social justice. Rabbi Edward E. Klein, my senior rabbi, always took great pride in being introduced as the first equal opportunity employer in the American rabbinate. I stayed at the Free Synagogue for 7 years, and to be honest, the circumstances under which I left were not all that pleasant. I hoped I would be given a chance at some point to be the senior rabbi, but that was not to be. Neither that synagogue nor any other was ready nor willing to grant the title of senior rabbi to a woman. Indeed, for 2 years, I was unable to find a full-time position. I served as a chaplain at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York City, and I accepted a part-time position at Temple Beth El in Elizabeth, New Jersey, a synagogue of older members who were always very warm and welcoming. In 1981, I became rabbi of Monmouth Reform Temple in Tinton Falls, New Jersey, a position I was privileged to hold for 25 years. The decision to retire 15 years ago was my own. However, I did not move away. I'm still in the community. And as Rabbi Emerita, I worship at my temple every week, enjoying as I do the view from the pew. I have never regretted my decision to enter the rabbinate, and clearly my life has been enriched by the people I've been privileged to serve for these past 5 decades. I am grateful to God that part of my life's work has been to open new doors for women in the Jewish community. But at the same time, I have tried never to lose sight of the larger mission of the Jewish people, which is to derive from the words of Torah a set of values and a sense of holiness that will enable us always to be partners with God in completing the world. And what that means from my vantage point is not only participating in the task of Tikkun Olam, but creating a Jewish community based on equality and inclusivity, remembering that all of us are God's children, and as such, we should all have the opportunity to fulfill our creative potential to the fullest. My experience tells me that we are richer for the gifts that female rabbis and female leaders bring to our shared task. Rethinking previous models of leadership and opening doors to partnership and networking and empowerment. Discovering new models of divinity, knowing that God embodies characteristics both masculine and feminine. Training new leaders to be more gender aware by welcoming to our institutions of higher learning respected female scholars able to share with us valuable lessons and insights that are unique to women. Creating new role models and allowing to be heard often for the first time. The stories of those whose voices have been silenced for too long, the countless number of women who have enriched our people from biblical times on. Surely one of the most powerful lessons we have learned from the civil rights movement is that if you do not see someone who looks like you in a position of leadership, then you begin to feel left out. You have a sense that it cannot be done. We teach our daughters and our sons that everything is possible. There are no limits on what they can achieve when seeking to fulfill their creative potential and contribute to the vitality of the Jewish people. But sometimes, when they interact with the institutions of Judaism, they discover a different message, a message that continues to exist in the larger society of which we are a part, a reluctance to believe that women are as competent and capable as men. For decades now, we have been trying to change that attitude in every field of human endeavor: medicine, law, accounting, education, even politics. For the sake of our survival, we need to continue to work to change it in the Jewish community as well, to make certain that our daughters and granddaughters can be whatever they want to be, that they have not only equal opportunity, but equal pay, and that they are free from all forms of sexual harassment. Ordaining women as rabbis has also taught us something about the meaning of success. When I was first ordained, I thought the ultimate goal was to become a rabbi of a large congregation. Indeed, as the first woman to be ordained, I thought it was my obligation. In so many different ways, we are taught that bigger is better. But in reality, life is not measured by wealth or power, material possessions, or fame. Life is counted in terms of goodness and growth. Someone once said that our purpose in living is not to get ahead of other people, but to get ahead of ourselves, always to play a better game of life. That is what success is all about. Have we done our best? Are we continuing to grow? Are we affected more deeply today by love and beauty and joy than we were yesterday? Are we more sensitive and compassionate to others? Have we learned to overcome our fears and accept our failures? Have we triumphed over selfishness and bitterness, cruelty and hatred? Do we count our blessings in such a way that we make our blessings count? That to me is success. And in the words of Albert Schweitzer, the great secret of success is to go through life as a person who never gets used up. Grow into your ideals so that life can never rob you of them. Now, people often think that I am the first woman rabbi, but in fact, I am the second. Radina Jonas was the first woman in the world to become a rabbi. She studied for the rabbinate in Berlin, but the professor who was her mentor died the year before she was ordained. And then the seminary refused to follow through, even though she had completed all the requirements, including a thesis entitled, "Can Women Serve as Rabbis?" She was forced to wait until 1935, when she was ordained privately by Rabbi Max Dienemann, president of the Association of Liberal Rabbis in Berlin. At first, she was permitted to serve only in schools, hospitals, and homes for the elderly. But as rabbis began to emigrate or be deported because of the Holocaust, she was invited to preach and fulfill rabbinic duties at various synagogues, gaining a reputation for her pastoral work and her preaching ability. A few years ago, as you heard Rabbi Feingold say, she and I had the privilege of visiting Berlin and walking in the footsteps of Regina Jonas with a group of rabbis, lay people, and historians. The trip was the idea of our friend and colleague, Dr. Gary Zola of the American Jewish Archives. He convinced the United States Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad to place a plaque at Terezin in memory of Regina Jonas. And he invited the Jewish Women's Archive and its founding director, Dr. Gail Reamer, to co-sponsor the trip. It was an amazing experience that words cannot really convey. I was quite shaken by the number of similarities between my life and that of Regina Jonas. She did not see herself as a pioneer or a famous person, and neither did I. I just wanted to be a rabbi, and so did she. Both of us shared a similar definition of feminism. That is, all people should be given the opportunity to fulfill their God-given potential to the fullest. Her mentor died the year before she was ordained, and so did mine. In her case, the seminary refused to follow through. In my case, those who tried to stop my ordination were unsuccessful. I was always held to a higher standard, and so was she. And often male rabbis and lay leaders would tell me to be patient, a word with which she was also familiar. She did not think a female rabbi should marry and have children. It would be too difficult. And ultimately, I came to the same decision, believing I myself would never be able to do both and do them well. She loved to preach and teach. In Terezin, we found handwritten pieces of paper which had the titles of some of her lectures, things like Women in Judaism, Women in the Bible, all the same topics that I and all women rabbis have been asked to speak about at one time or another. Before being deported to Terezin, Rabbi Jonas gave her documents to the Berlin Jewish community for safekeeping. Had she not done so, we would know even less than we do now about her life and the significant contributions she made to the Jewish community, which continue to bear fruit even today. Not realizing that I was in effect following in her footsteps, I announced several years ago that I would be donating my documents and papers to the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. And I invited all female rabbis of whatever denomination to do the same, so that those doing research on the history of women in the rabbinate can come to one place and find what they need. When we were in Berlin, we had an opportunity to see the papers which had remained hidden until after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is probably why so many people have never heard of her. We were overwhelmed with emotion when the archivist brought out this tiny box of papers, all we have left of Rabbi Regina Jonas, except for those few handwritten titles we saw at Terezin. It was at Terezin that we dedicated a plaque in her memory, ensuring that she would never again be forgotten. Participating in the ceremony were, among others, Helga Hoskova, an artist who at that time was one of the 100 remaining survivors of Terezin, and her son and granddaughter, who provided music on the violin and organ for the ceremony. I will never again hear Kol Nidre without remembering their rendition. Helga's story reminds us that God enables ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and that Holocaust survivors triumphed over Hitler by returning to life rather than retreating from it, by having children and grandchildren, and showing that despite the horrors of the Holocaust, there is meaning and purpose in human life. The four firsts, Rabbi Sandy Sasso of the Reconstructionist movement, Rabbi Amy Eilberg of the Conservative movement, Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz of the Modern Orthodox movement, and me representing Reform, participated in the ceremony at Terezin. Each of us read a passage written by Regina Jonas herself. This is part of what I chose to read. I hope a time will come for all of us in which there will be no more questions on the subject of woman. For as long as there are questions, something is wrong. But if I must say what drove me as a woman to become a rabbi, two elements come to mind: my belief in the godly calling and my love for people. God has placed abilities and callings in all our hearts without regard to gender. Thus, each of us has the duty, whether man or woman, to realize those gifts God has given. If you look at things this way, one takes woman and man for what they are, human beings. Every time I read this, it amazes me that these words were written back in the 1930s. There was something quite remarkable that day about giving life to her words and affirming our connection to her. Then we recited El Malei Rachamim, perhaps the first time that this memorial prayer had ever been recited for Regina Jonas. As I think about her, one of the things I most admire is that she chose the well-being of her people over her own self-interest. She could have escaped the horrors of the Holocaust, but chose instead to accompany her people to the concentration camps, to continue to minister to their needs and help them find meaning and purpose in the values of Jewish tradition. We cannot help but stand in awe of her courage. We return from our journey prepared to tell her story, to ensure that she is given her rightful place in the chain of Jewish tradition that binds together all the generations of our people, past, present, and future, and determined to make certain that her yahrzeit would be observed from year to year in synagogues of all denominations. The actual date of her death is unknown, but with the help of the Holocaust Museum in Washington and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, we determined that she was taken from Terezin together with her mother on October 12, 1944. Her name actually appears on the transport list. And they arrived in Auschwitz 2 days later on October 14, 1944, where it is assumed that she was murdered that very day because we never heard anything else about her. And that day happened to be Shabbat Bereshit, the first Sabbath of the Jewish year on which we begin reading Torah all over again. Therefore, we have chosen Shabbat Bereshit as the date of her yahrzeit. And we hope that next fall, you and your family and your friends, wherever they live, will join us in saying Kaddish for her. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share her story. I like to think that whenever we do, we bring honor to her memory. I conclude now with some words of wisdom that came about a few years ago when I was asked to contribute to a book edited by Molly Meir called "If I Only Had 5 Things to Pass On from My Life, They Would Be." Unfortunately, I don't think the book ever came to be. And I was sorry about that because I really wanted to hear what other people wrote. But over the years, this has become a very important exercise for me, especially at the time of the holy days when we take stock of our lives. I think this is a good um, exercise for slichot. To think about what would you like to pass on from your life? What 5 things? So I'm going to share with you now my 5 things. Number 1, know yourself and be yourself. When I was in rabbinical school, I always assumed I would marry and have children. In fact, I often used to say that in my synagogue, there would be a nursery next to my study. After I was ordained and began serving God and the Jewish people, I discovered that I would never be able to have a career and a family and do both well. I stand in awe of those who can, but I know that I'm not one of them. So I chose to devote all my time and energy to my career, and I have never been sorry because I know that the people whose lives I touch are now part of my extended family. Number 2, don't worry. There are moments in every life when worry overwhelms us and inhibits our ability to function. For those moments, I have developed my worry rule. Sit down every morning for 10 minutes and worry as much as you want. And then get up and welcome the many opportunities for growth and for good that the new day brings and make the most of them. There will be another 10 minutes tomorrow to worry again. Number 3, always try your best. Many people hesitate to try new things because they are afraid of failure. I believe the only true failure is in never daring to fail. Success feels good, but there is nothing wrong with failure as long as we try our best and learn from our mistakes. The world moves forward every day because someone is willing to take the risk. Number 4, live with humility. Our sages taught people should have 2 pockets so they can reach into one or another according to their needs. In one pocket, there should be a slip of paper with the words, "The world was created for my sake." And in the other, a slip of paper with the words, "I am but dust and ashes." In our day and age, humility seems to be a forgotten virtue. Being humble does not mean that we should deny or negate our achievements. On the contrary, taking pride in our accomplishments brings great joy. But pausing to remember that we do not stand alone is even more enriching. Saying thank you on a regular basis to God, who gives us the power to create, and to others who have helped us along the way, keeps us from becoming arrogant. And finally, maintain your sense of humor. One way to deal with life's difficulties is by discovering and embracing the healing power of laughter. Many a tense moment has been relieved by bringing a bit of humor to the situation. An old Yiddish proverb advises, "Weep before God, laugh before people." Learning to laugh soothes the spirit, and learning to laugh at yourself keeps you from taking yourself too seriously. Laughter is contagious, and it makes the world a more meaningful place. As I come now to the end of my remarks and prepare to take your questions, let me share with you my favorite poem, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost, which pretty much sums up the way I feel about my life. Two roads diverged in the yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Thank you so much, and now I am ready for your questions.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Sally Priesand. This was just such a pleasure. You know, I've heard your story before. Maybe you tell it slightly different every time, and I thank you for being willing to tell it over and over again. I think this year especially you've been telling it over and over again.
Yeah.
But the inspiration that comes from your words of wisdom, not just those 5 at the end, but all throughout, is very inspiring to me, and I'm sure to many others. So thank you again. And I want to open the floor for questions, and you can either just, open your mic and talk, or raise your hand, or what have you, or if you prefer to put questions in the chat, and I can ask them for you if anyone wants to do that. So would someone like to start us out?
Don't be bashful.
Don't forget to unmute yourself. There's Esther has a question.
I'm wondering how you were received by your male colleagues along the way, particularly in those early years. Were you included or a little left out?
Well, when I was at rabbinic school, my classmates always made me feel part of the class. Mm-hmm. There were some who didn't really want women to be rabbis, but I did not feel any discrimination or bullying. I felt that I was part of the class, and on the day that I was ordained, my classmates, when I was called to the bima, my classmates very spontaneously stood up to honor this moment in Jewish history, and that's a memory that I cherish and always feel very good about. I must admit that over the years, because so much attention was placed on me, and every anniversary I ever had was celebrated by the whole Reform movement, I always felt bad. I felt like we were leaving out my classmates. So I was always apologizing to them. And I remember once at one of our conventions, I had the honor of reading Torah. So I insisted that my classmates would come up for the Aliyah. And that worked out very, very nicely. I also remember that in the early years, the media was always following me around. And when they came to the school, my classmates were always jockeying for who was going to sit next to me so they could be in the picture too.
Great question, Esther. I never really thought about that piece of what it must have been like for the others in your class, and on both sides. I mean, I think Esther was thinking, how were you accepted? But I like how you turned it around about how this affected them. Somebody else.
Yeah, I have a question. From the time you will ordain, how many years after that did you feel like it's starting to be real common for women rabbi?
Well, I have a sort of a custom of attending ordination every year here in New York, since I live in New Jersey. But every fifth year, I go to Cincinnati for ordination just for myself. It's very meaningful to me. And I was present. Wasn't that many years, maybe 10 or 15 years after I was ordained, that the class in New York was already more women than men. And I was kind of shocked that, oh, wow, it happened already. The thing you have to remember is that the rabbinic school with your undergraduate work takes 9 years. There's 4 years of undergraduate and then 5 years of rabbinic school. At this time, that first year of rabbinic school is spent in Israel. That was not possible when I was there. I was of the last year of that undergraduate program that I told you about. So it takes a long time. I was ordained in 1972. In 1974, Rabbi Sandy Sasso of the Reconstructionist movement was ordained. In 1975 and 76, there were 2 women ordained from HUC. So it was beginning along the way. Now we have 835 women rabbis ordained in the Reform movement, and well over 1,000 women in all the movements of Judaism, conservative, Reconstructionist, and modern Orthodox, which is very exciting. They at Yeshivat Maharat in Riverdale, New York, they now have 5, 6, 7 women a year that they've been ordaining. And as far as I know, they all find a job somewhere. Of course, the Orthodox movement itself remains opposed to that.
So the movement didn't officially sanction it, but certain elements within the movement will hire women, certain congregations. Is that how?
That's right. More modern Orthodox are willing to break the rules, which is what you need. That is what you need to have. You have to have people who are willing to take a step forward.
Thank you. Somebody else? Just a little add-on to your question, Gary, from my perspective, is that when I was ordained 10 years after Sally, I was among the first 60-something. There were 12 in my class, although only 4 of us in Cincinnati. And I think when I went to rabbinical school 5 years after Sally had been ordained, I had the naive idea that by the time I was ordained 10 years after the first, that I wouldn't be a pioneer, or no one would think it was anything unusual. And that was completely wrong, because most of the women before me had gone to the 2 coasts to serve. And I came to Wisconsin. And actually, Sally, you had been in a high holiday pulpit at Congregation Shalom.
In Milwaukee.
And,
yes.
And so people had seen, a female rabbi, but I was the first one to come and be a full-time rabbi in the state. And I was alone here for 16 years. Until now, there's several female rabbis in the state of Wisconsin, but for 16 years, I was the only one. So,
well, we always are, we're always a little bit naive. When I went to the Free Synagogue and after 7 years decided that I would leave, I thought, oh, well, it'll be easy to find another pulpit because I've been at one of the premier synagogues in America with a fine reputation. And I will tell you that is the only time in my career that I thought about leaving the rabbinate, because no one would speak to me. I couldn't get a job. For 2 years, I couldn't get a full-time position. and it was very difficult, and I was angry because I did not feel that the Reform movement did its part in preparing congregations for female rabbis. So first I went before the placement commission. I walked in the room, there were 16 men around the table. And I said, I hope you know you're part of the problem. I never hesitated to say what I thought. And then I wrote this scathing article for Reform Judaism magazine. And I took it to Rabbi Malcolm Stern, who was the placement director at that time. And he read it and he said, you're making some good points, but if you publish this article, your career is over. And he said, and so I'm going to rewrite it for you. And he sat right down at what was then typewriter. And right in front of me, he rewrote it. And what he wrote to bring those problems to the forefront, that was what went into Reform Judaism magazine. And so really, we're very grateful to him. So you just never know. One of the things that I learned quickly is because I'm the first to face every problem that comes along. And I will tell you that when I was first ordained, I was very conscious of the fact that people judged the idea of women in the rabbinate by me. So if, for example, they came to my temple and I didn't give the most brilliant sermon that was ever given, they may have left with the thought, well, we don't need any women rabbis. But for many years, I made decisions on what was best for women in the rabbinate, not necessarily what was best for me.
I can relate to that, feeling like I had to do everything well because I was the only example a lot of people had. We have a question here for you, Sally, in the chat. Did Sally have any experiences at the wall in Jerusalem with women of the wall?
No, the few times that I've been there, I've not been there with women at the wall. We didn't have any problems obviously we're separated, the men on one side and the women, but nobody attacked us or did anything every time that I took a trip or a group from my temple.
Somebody else?
I have a question. What a great story you have in the presentation. I grew up in a conservative congregation and came to Reform Judaism about 20 years ago when I was 35 and discovered this whole new world. So to hear, and to me, it's just so inclusive and welcoming and accepting, and to hear this, what you've gone through, just boggles my mind how a movement that is so progressive and open wasn't. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. What are some of the other changes, the positive changes that you've seen in Reform Judaism throughout, your career?
Well, I guess I should just explain something about how I feel about Reform Judaism. I feel it's harder to be a Reform Jew than any other kind of Jew. And that is because you get to make your own choices. But to make a meaningful choice, you have to know what you're choosing from. And so you have to do everything. And then you can decide, well, I like this isn't for me, whatever. And I think that's a blessing. For example, I did not grow up in a kosher home. Some of my very favorite foods were shrimp, spare ribs, things like that. And when I was when I was in college, my roommate grew up in a kosher home, so I agreed that we would make our apartment kosher. I figured this would be a good time to try it and see if it's meaningful to me. Turns out that it wasn't really meaningful. What I decided on is that I keep biblical kosher, which means I don't eat anything that the Bible says not to eat. So you get to make your own decisions, but you have to work hard at making a decision that is meaningful. And that's what I've always tried to do and help my congregants do it. So there aren't things that specifically pop in my mind right now of what has changed in Reform Judaism over my course. Well, I just thought of something. Patrilineal descent. The idea that a person is Jewish if their mother or father is Jewish and they are raised Jewish. Meaning you can't just at 22 say, I don't know anything about Judaism, but I decided I'm Jewish now. You have to study and go to religious school or I always suggest to people who have had no religious education to take a conversion class, an introduction to Judaism class, and then perhaps to have a ceremony of affirmation. So patrilineality is something that continues to divide us from the rest of the Jewish community. When I was ordained, there were some people who thought that this was just a fad and it wasn't going to be going anywhere. And I remember an Orthodox rabbi said, well, she'll only be a footnote in history. So bet it would be interesting if he could see how many female rabbis there are now. And of course, today, my legacy is that I opened doors for women in the Jewish community and tried to hold those doors open. But also, I'd like to think that my opening doors for women also opened doors for other people. When I was ordained, most people were conscious of two sexes, male and female. Today, we know there are a lot more, whether it's transgender, non-binary, LGBTQ, whatever it is. We're still at the point where we're learning to welcome all people and be truly inclusive in our synagogues. And so we still need to do some work on that. As for women, you should understand that female rabbis are generally paid less than male rabbis. Surprised me a lot because I know that Jews, whether women or men, would be in the front lines of the protests out in the regular community when we're talking about equal pay or ERA or any of those kinds of things. So it's kind of surprising to me that people would not do that within their own community. We're working on that and making progress. Today, we've been able to, because of, I think, the experiences of women, we've been able to introduce paid family leave for women and men. That's a very good thing. And one of the things I've also noticed is that sometimes in a congregation where there's a male senior rabbi and a female assistant rabbi, the male rabbi is called Rabbi Schwartz and the female rabbi is called Sally. That's disrespectful. And I'm surprised that it still happens. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was the head of the search committee at Monmouth Reform Temple. She told me to be certain that everyone calls me Rabbi Priesand. And they did. And and they still do. I mean, now that I'm retired, call me Rabbi Priesand, call me Rabbi, call me Sally, call me what you want. I see that when I first started out, the media gave me the name Rabbi Sal. And nowadays, I see the pendulum has kind of swung backward again, that lots of rabbis are called Rabbi with their first name. So in my synagogue now, especially the kids call me Rabbi Sally. But when I go to services, I sit in the last row, and the kids come and sit with me. And they gave me the name Back Row Sally. So I go by that name all the time. Actually, our cantor, I'm very close to her family. And at her son's bar mitzvah, he's the one who named me Back Row Sally. So.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi Priesand. We've gone over time, and we just want to thank you for giving up this evening for us like you have for so many others over this special anniversary year. And we feel very privileged to have had the chance to listen to you and then to dialogue with you. I do want to take a moment to say that this program was made possible by the Shemro Educational and Cultural Trust of Beth Hillel Temple. And we're so grateful for the foresight of the Shemro family many, many decades ago to set aside funds for special programs like this. Thank you all for participating. We're going to, I hope still in the remaining part of this year to somehow celebrate this 50th anniversary at Beth Hillel. And Rabbi Priesand, I'll see you in a few days in San Diego.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for inviting me to share the evening with you, and I hope our paths will cross again.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.